From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, I can officially say good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name's DeAnna. I'm the head of the library's recorded sound section at the Packard campus and also here in our research center, Recorded Sound Research Center in the Madison building. I'm here today along with our curator, Matt Barton, to share our excitement about the acquisition of a vast archive of radio interviews, the Sports Byline collection. It was acquired in late 2012, and we've been busy since then cataloging and digitally preserving it at the Packard campus. And it's about time for us to unveil a little more than we have in the past and let everybody know about it. And to help us do that, we've got some special guests here today. You're going to hear some selections from the collection, and the founder and host of Sports Byline USA is with us, Ron Barr, who we're going to introduce shortly, and he's going to play some audio, introduce our special guests, and do what he is really one of the world's best at, and that is talk about sports and get us all excited about sports. So we're looking forward to that. We're going to save some time at the end of the program for your questions to ask the guests. So if you have those, hang on to them, and we'll get to that. Libraries and archives are sometimes referred to as memory institutions, and the Library of Congress as the repository of our national memory, or what Librarian of Congress James Billington calls our national patrimony. In fact, there's no part of that patrimony or those memories that is more democratically and collectively shared across all boundaries of age, race, and socioeconomic status than sports. It isn't just memories of great games and great players. It's also important social history, and it's in this collection. When Sports Byline USA launched in October of 1988, Ron's first guest was the great Willie Mays. And in that studio interview, Mays talked about being a rookie in the Negro Leagues and his memories of great Negro League players. In fact, the Sports Byline archive contains the largest collection of audio interviews with Negro League players in existence. So the acquisition of the collection is a 3-year collaboration with Sports Byline, and we're going to be preserving it and making as much of it as available on the internet as we can in the course of those 3 years, and more to come. To date, we've digitized over 2,000 of the programs, and that means we've gotten that audio off of degrading audio cassettes that would have been lost to obsolescence or the ravages of time, and we're very proud of that. These interviews join other great recordings in the library's holdings, including Clem McCarthy's classic calls of the Lewis Smelling fight, the match race between Seabiscuit and War Admiral, Bob Wolf's interviews with Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, and Jackie Robinson, just to name a few. In fact, to get us started, Matt's going to present to us some recordings from the NBC collection that will give us a sort of a historical sense of the evolution of sports broadcasting, and in particular, interviewing styles. So here's Matt Barton.
Thank you. Sports Byline has been a force in sports broadcasting for over 25 years now, and I was just commenting to Ron Barr a few minutes ago that it's an interesting thing. Radio of the 20s, 30s, and 40s was very, very different from what it is now. However, sports has been a staple of radio since almost the beginning. And in fact, one of the earliest surviving radio broadcasts is from 1927, and it's the Jack Dempsey-Gene Tunney long count heavyweight title fight. And in fact, one of the reasons that we know just how long the long count was is because it was recorded. So I thought it would be fun to play a couple of clips. These are both from the 1930s, just to show you, how far interviewing has come in sports broadcasting. In network radio, the 1930s was very tightly scripted. They were extremely concerned about anything, the least bit unrehearsed or the least bit off color going out over the airwaves. So we're going to hear, however, an unscripted moment from 1935 This is an interview with former heavyweight champion Max Baer a few minutes after losing the heavyweight title to James Braddock. If you saw the film Cinderella Man, Max Baer was portrayed as really a monstrous human being who shouldn't have been allowed on the streets, and that was really not fair to him. That's not what he was like. He was actually a very funny and personable guy who made a living as a comedian after he left the ring. However, he was known as something of a playboy. And so here, John, if you have it queued up, we're going to hear Max Baer interviewed in 1935, probably about 15 minutes after losing his heavyweight title to James J. Braddock.
Good evening, everybody. Indeed, we're back in Max's dressing room, and the sight back here is a lot different than you'll imagine. There's no weeping. Max Baer smiled through victory, and he's sitting here tonight with a lot of his admirers around. The dressing room is packed, and Max is still smiling. He came in here, took off his robe, sat down, and began to expose his hand to the newspaper men. There's something wrong with it, but I want Max Baer, who is acquainted with speaking over the radio, the same as any radio announcer, to tell his own story. Come on in, Max Baer.
Hello, Mother and Dad, and hello, T and Lovey. I want to tell you all, and then folks too, that had a grand time out there. Of course, I lost the title, but they come and go, you know. And I'm glad and I'm really happy to see Jimmy happy when they said, the winner, a new champion of the world. He jumped up in the air and he threw his arms around me. He'll appreciate it more than I did, I guess, and he needs it more. After all, he's got a family and he's married. Of course, I might have a family around the country too, but I don't know it. Good night, everyone.
Max, did you hurt yourself out there in the ring at all?
Well, listen, there's no alibis. Let's forget it. I haven't got a broken leg, and the heat didn't bother me, and my hands, well, let's forget everything.
He actually
Everything
did
was
break his
fine.
hand during the fight.
Did you break your hand in there?
Well, no alibis, no alibis.
No, but is that hand broke?
Well, you can see it. Do they look all right? They look a little swollen, do they?
Well, you got a little bubble under the eye, but what about that left hand? Is it broke or not? I'd like you to tell the radio.
Well, listen, if I said that was broken, and say alibi. Well, everybody seems to be satisfied. The same crowd that was around my dressing room last year said, hello, champ. They're around the other fellow's dressing room. Now, next time, they'll be around mine again, or maybe my brother's.
Max, what's your plan?
What's my plans? Go into my cattle business. It's easier on the eyes, Pally.
You're not going to quit fighting, Max.
No. Well, I have a little put away, you know, so my attorneys can't get a hold of it.
Okay. I don't know how much that changed policies, network radio, but I'm sure it had an effect. The next clip we're going to hear is from about 4 years later. Who remembers Bobby Riggs? Oh, good. Okay. Probably you remember his famous match with Billie Jean King in 1973, the so-called Battle of the Sexes. Well, he was, at that point, he was definitely the king of sports trash talk. However, in the 30s and 40s, he really was one of the top tennis players in the world. We're going to hear him in 1939 at age 21. Still an amateur, and he's talking to George Jessel on the radio, and they make reference to a match and to the Australian team. It's the Davis Cup, and the U.S. team with Riggs had actually just lost to the Australian team. So here's Bobby Riggs with George Jessel in 1939, and notice, you know, it sounds like a different guy, and he's obviously reading a script, and it's a very different personality than we knew in the 70s.
And Mr. Jessel, don't expect any alibis from me. We all played the best we could, and the Australians were just too tough.
Well, spoken like the game little sportsman that you are, Bobby. But before we go any further, son, I have a confession to make.
What's that?
I have never seen a tennis match.
Oh, go on.
No.
I don't know anyone who hasn't seen a tennis match.
Well, I haven't. I give you my word. Where do they usually play them?
Well, they have tournaments at Rye, Seabright, Southampton, and Newport. Haven't you ever been to Newport?
Oh, of course, Lowe's, Newport. But, Bobby, it's no use. I tell you the truth. I have never seen a tennis match. All I've seen are pictures of Alice Marble and Kay Stammers.
What? You haven't seen pictures of Tilden, Vines, and Budge?
No,
Why not?
because I only look at pictures of Alice Marble and Kay Stammers. That's why.
I get it, Mr. Jessel. You don't have to shout. But what I don't understand is why you didn't play tennis when you were a kid.
Well, Bobby, I couldn't practice. There was always so much wash hanging on the lines, you know? Closest I ever came was ping pong, which is tennis with an inferiority complex. So, Bobby, I took up baseball instead. Now, is tennis anything like baseball?
Not very much.
Well, now, how about the scoring? I mean, what score in tennis would correspond to, like, 3-0 in a baseball game?
I guess that would be 40-love.
What'd you say?
40-love.
Yeah, that's got me right on the button. 40 love. Are you sure 40's not too late, Bobby?
Mr. Jessel, you don't understand. Love means nothing in tennis.
No, or in Hollywood. But tell me, Bobby.
Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Gene now.
I want to introduce the host and founder of Sports Byline. Ron Barr is a veteran journalist and broadcaster. He began his career at the Washington Post in D.C., and following that he became a freelance reporter with ABC Sports. He ventured into television, working locally in Boston, then moved over to national network assignments, hosting pregame, halftime, and postgame shows of NFL games for CBS Sports. Later, he moved to Seattle, where he became sports director for KIRO Television. Then it was on to San Francisco, where he's based now, I believe. And he became the sports anchor at KRON Television. He broadcast Stanford and Cal games, football games, basketball games. And in fact, he won a prestigious Emmy Award for writing From San Quentin to Candlestick, a television feature that chronicled a young prison convict's dream come true opportunity to try out in front of the San Francisco Giants. It resulted in his getting invited to spring training tryout with the Giants upon his release from prison. In '88, he launched Sports Byline USA, a 3-hour nationally broadcast nightly sports talk show. Was the first national sports talk show and network, and has become America's largest sports talk radio network. It's heard on 200 U.S. radio stations, reaches more than 2.5 million people. Also, it's heard worldwide on the more than 500 AFRNS, that's the Armed Forces Radio Network stations, in Canada and also Radio New Zealand. It's also on an in-flight version of Sports Byline. It's heard on all domestic and international flights. In July 2002, the Sports Byline network expanded to 24 hours a day with the launch of Sirius Satellite Radio. So without more further ado, let me introduce Ron Barr.
I'll stand here if that's all right with you guys. Okay. I want to say thank you. It's wonderful to be back in Washington. This is a homecoming for me. I was born in Washington, D.C. My family, who is here today, is from this area as well. My grandfather worked with Paul Garber with the Smithsonian when it was just the Air Museum, not Air and Space Museum, when it was just I think it was like a Quonset hut on the mall at one time. And one of my favorite memories is being over in Suitland, Maryland when I was a child, sitting on the ground, and I have a picture of looking up at my grandfather in the nose cone of the Enola Gay as they were refurbishing it. It's something that means a lot. My first job out of high school was at the Washington Post. The great Ben Bradley was kind enough to right a wrong, and I got a job in the sports department. And then 6 months later, I went over to the Alexandria Gazette. So I have deep roots in this particular area. I can't tell you how honored and flattered I am that the Library of Congress is going to be the perpetual home for this collection. One of the forces in launching Sports Byline, because to be quite candid with you, I knew nothing about business. And one night when I was doing a local evening sports magazine, sports talk show in San Francisco, I had Duke Snider on. And I got a caller, and the Duke's caller said to me, "You know, Ron, I've waited 35 years to talk to Duke Snider, and tonight you're giving me the chance." And that was the seed. I knew that was what fans wanted to do, to be able to talk to their heroes. And so my broadcasting partner in tennis was Billie Jean King, who I have the utmost respect and love for. And I said to her, I've got this idea to launch the first national sports talk network. But you know what? I don't know anything about business or anything. And she looked me in the eye and she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Ron, I think I know you well enough. You never want to look over your shoulder and wonder if you could have." And you know what? She was absolutely right about that. So on October the 24th, 1988, we launched Sports Byline with 12 radio stations. I did not know whether anybody would call because it was a new concept. But I did know one thing, and that was the fact that I could interview people. And so I had asked Willie Mays if he would be my first guest. Now, Willie and I aren't close friends, but being in San Francisco, he said yes. And Willie flew in from Reno just to do that 1 hour live in the studio. And as I was walking out, I said to him, "Willie, thank you very much. Why did you go to such an effort?" He said, I like the way you treat people, and I want to be able to look back someday and say I played a part. And indeed, Willie Mays did play a part. And that was the launch of Sports Byline. We went on then to become the first network to sign on with Sirius, which became Sirius XM. And in 2000, I had to make a decision with the company whether to sell, merge, or what we were going to do. And I said, as long as the big boys were developing delivery systems, they all need one thing: content. And that's how we have grown this out to be 10 different platforms besides radio, internet, iHeartRadio Talk, Stitcher, TuneIn, the airlines, all of those, and I'm proud of it. This collection of interviews covers more than 60 years of sports. And one of the things that I learned early going is that you and the other fans out there can't relate to an athlete, baseball player trying to hit a ball at 95 miles an hour. They can't relate to what the basketball player has to go through and do. But what they can always relate to is the human aspect of it. Mark Teixeira of the Yankees, the first time I interviewed him a couple of years ago, I saw that he grew up in Baltimore. So when he came on, let me preface this by saying I can tell within 4 answers what kind of interview it's going to be, and they can tell within 4 questions what kind of interview it's going to be. So I said to Mark, I said, by the way, you grew up in Baltimore. Tell me about the first time your dad took you to Memorial Stadium and you saw Brooks Robinson. And his eyes got big. And from then on, it was just open. And that's what I've tried to do with this collection. I mean, there'll never be another interview with Mickey Mantle. There'll never be another interview with Tom Landry, Bill Walsh, all the great ones. And we have many, many of those. And what they've done is they've given you perspectives. And you're going to hear in just a second some of the perspectives and some of the way they answered questions. And I can only tell you that this, I've been often asked what my legacy is, and I guess the first thing is I'm alive. I think that's a question, don't they ask after you're gone? But first of all, great friends, no doubt about it. But this collection is part of that legacy. The other thing is going to Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo, and being the only network that's ever broadcast live there. And what we did when we went over there is I let the soldiers, I took my friends like Brian Billick and Adonal Foyle and other friends. It's pretty hard to say, hey, how would you like to go to Iraq and Afghanistan and get shot at? You know, I always got 2 responses. One is, let me ask my wife. And the player would come back and said, she said no. Or the other one said, the player comes back and says, I talked to my wife, she says, go ahead and go and let's check that insurance policy. So you always got, but to be able to let those soldiers talk with the athletes that were there, as well as talk with the athletes that called. And I remember getting an email after one of the trips from a father who said, Mr. Barr, thank you very much. My son called me the other day and said, guess what happened to me? He said, I knew he wasn't dead, but I was afraid he had been hurt badly. He said, I got to talk to Tom Brady. And those are the things that really mean a great deal to me and stick with me. And the other thing that I'm particularly proud of is the mentoring that I've done with young sportscasters, because we don't work with young sportscasters. The media has changed so greatly, it's more TMZ and entertainment than it is reporting. And there is an art form to asking questions. And a lot of people, a lot of young broadcasters will ask questions that they want to hear the answer to. That's wrong. You ask the question your audience wants to hear the answer to. And let me share with you a couple of sound bites here that I think you might enjoy. I'm going to start with Jerry Rice. One of the nice things about being in sports a long time, and Brian will tell you this about the relationships that you have and that endure over the long course of your career. And I saw Jerry Rice when he was drafted. Bill Walsh was a dear friend of mine. I was the play-by-play announcer at Stanford when Bill was there the first time. I also did the game in 1982, Cal Stanford, with the ball lateraled all over the field. And what I'm proud about that is that Joe Starkey did the Cal broadcast and lost it, which I understand. But I said during the course of describing that play, the game is over with. And 10 years later, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a picture on the front page on the 10th anniversary, and in the upper corner of it, the official going like this, because he had looked down the line and see the knee go down on the line. But with 15,000 people on the field, you aren't changing that play and that call, I can tell you. So I got to know Jerry Rice very, very well, very interesting person, and I watched him go from a rough, ragged type of young man coming out of Mississippi to becoming the polished person that you have seen him today. Greatest wide receiver I've ever seen, hardest worker I've ever seen as well. And this clip, you know, when you think about it, I have so much respect for athletes that come out of their comfort area. And Jerry Rice, can you imagine going on national television doing something that you've never been trained in? I mean, you could embarrass yourself. And so I asked Jerry about doing things that you're not comfortable with, and here's what he said.
When I did Dancing with the Stars, I took that uniform off. I took it off, and all of a sudden, I was open for criticism. I didn't have that security blanket anymore, and I think people really got a chance to connect with me. And it's a lot of people in life right now, they want to take chances, but they're afraid to. And I say to them, go for it. You only live once.
Great advice. But that's a question, you know, you might not hear anywhere else. There are a lot of great broadcasters in our profession, and I think one of the all-time best is John Miller, who was teamed with Joe Morgan for a long time on ESPN. I've known John because he grew up in the Bay Area. He was 22 years old when Charlie Finley hired him to do the A's games. And he started his career in Santa Rosa, California, and he and I were talking one time about all the different sports he had done, because he is a guy that can call play-by-play of any sport at all. He says, I remember when I was very young, he said, I was up in Santa Rosa, and one of the first assignments I had was doing water polo, and he said it was fine until the horses drowned. But one of the things that he does so very, very well is mimic other people. And of course, one of the all-time greats in our profession, he does Harry Carey very well, but is the great Vin Scully. And when he was on the show, because you got to remember, he was the broadcaster for the Baltimore Orioles when they lost 20-plus ball games to open up a season one time. And you better have some other material if the team's playing that bad, I'll tell you. So anyway, here is John Miller doing his Vin Scully.
I love Vin Scully. I think he's the best who's ever broadcast baseball. Everybody, I mean, people love Harry Carey, might not feel that way about Vinny, but for me, he's the best ever. I never understood his international fame until I went to Japan last year with the Major League All-Star team, televised a couple of games, and I had at long last to hear the legendary Genshiro Asami, the great broadcaster of the Tokyo Giants, lo these many years. And I was very excited. I filled with expectation. Flipped on the TV, and you can imagine my surprise when he came on, and he was doing Scully. You know, Watashi wa Karakoin Stadium ni orimasu. Hajime mashite doze yoroshiku lo bontu. You know, odote ta dakemasen ka foul. You know.
Very, very talented. One question I know that will always be asked in any speaking engagement is, who's your favorite interview or interviews? And, you know, that's so hard. This library has over 10,000 interviews in it. They're long form, anywhere from 10 minutes to 35 minutes. But obviously, somebody like Billie Jean King and others like that, Willie Mays, are very, very special to me. But as you heard Gene say, this library contains the largest collection of Negro League baseball players. That has been captured in this library. And I mean, somebody that you may not even know, like Peanut Johnson. She was 5'2", only African-American to pitch in the Negro Leagues for the Indianapolis Clowns, and it was so special. But certainly somebody who I got to know very well is the late Buck O'Neil. He played for the Kansas City Monarchs, and I asked him a question. I said, tell me, Buck, about your best day in baseball.
Yeah, we opened the season in Memphis, Tennessee on Easter Sunday, 1943. And listen, first time up, I doubled. The next time up, I singled. The next time up, I hit the ball over the left field fence. The next time up, I hit the ball to left center. Looked like it was going out the park. I'm going to first base, holler, hit the fence, hit the fence, hit the fence. And it did hit the fence. Bounced back between the center fielder and the left fielder. I get to third base. The coach calling me to come on and get an inside the park home run. But I stopped at third because I wanted that to hit for the cycle. And I did. And listen, that night I get to the hotel. I'm relaxing. And William Dismuke, who was our traveling secretary, was downstairs having dinner. And the man that owned the restaurant in the hotel, his wife was a school teacher. And she had asked some young school teachers to come and meet some of the ball players. And so they were having dinner downstairs, and Disney told me to come downstairs. They had some people want me to meet. And when I got downstairs, the people were sitting at a table right in front of the door. And when I opened the door, I looked right in this young woman's eyes, and I walked straight to her. I said, "My name is Buck O'Neill. What's yours?" I married her, and we were married for 51 years. I had a great day that Easter Sunday.
Those are memories that you just can't forget. I'll wrap this up with sharing with you one of the great things is a storytelling that you don't hear very much. Willie said to me he laments the fact that players don't tell stories today, but in the form that I do my show and the network, it works out very well. Quick one, good friend of ours, Bill Walsh, after he wins 3 Super Bowls, goes into the Hall of Fame, comes back to Stanford to coach a second time. And he's on the show, and I said to him, I said, Bill, I can't imagine you going out and begging an 18-year-old to come play football for you. And he said, let me tell you a story. He says, I was on a 1-week-long recruiting trip, last stop Spokane, Washington. I'm going down country roads as the sun's going down with a flashlight looking for this darn recruit's house. He said, I finally find it. He says, I go in and have my 7th meal in 7 days. I am bone tired. And he said, after dinner, we go out and sit in the living room, and I look over in front of this roaring fireplace, and I see the family dog like this. And he said, now, Ron, you know me well enough. I don't like small talk, and I'm not good at it. So he said, I turned to the family and said, I've been on the road for a week, and he said, I really wish I could be doing what your dog's doing now. They looked over at the dog, and it was licking itself between its legs. I said, did you get the kid? He said, no, he went to UCLA. Again, I want to thank you very, very much. We've got some other guests, but Gene. Oh, okay. Yeah, let me bring up my 2 other guests. These are dear, dear friends. They're also partners in Sports Byline, which I thank them for. Brian Billick was the head coach of the Baltimore Ravens for 9 seasons, Super Bowl championship. And make sure you see the ring before you go. Of Super Bowl 35 against the Giants. Also, he was the offensive coordinator for the Minnesota Vikings at the time in which they set the record for points scored in a season, and also 40 touchdowns. And he has recently been with Fox Sports doing NFL games, and now will be with the NFL Network and other things in new media. And so, Brian Billick, come on up, Brian. This other friend is a very special friend as well. I've known Adonal Foyle for all the time he's been in the NBA, just retired about 3 seasons ago, 13 years with the Golden State Warriors in Orlando. But the interesting thing about him, a lot of people have images of athletes. They think about them as jocks. This is one of the most well-rounded human beings I've ever known. He grew up on a small island of 3.5 miles by 1.25 miles, didn't play organized basketball till he was 16. He had neither electricity nor running water, and there was a couple who were Colgate professors who came down to the island to do a study, and they ended up, I guess, adopting, is that the fair thing to say? Adopting him and bringing him back. He went on to Colgate, became an academic All-American, drafted in the first round by the Golden State Warriors, but while playing in the NBA, he founded Democracy Matters, a nonprofit political organization that encourages grassroots involvement in the campaign finance reform movement. And the other thing was that he was inducted into the World Sports Humanitarian Hall of Fame. Adonal Foyle.
Should we open it up to questions?
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about sports interviewing and
Yeah, let's talk about I'd love to hear Adonal and Brian's take on being now out of sport and on the other side of the microphone, and if it's given you a different perspective for for the work that the media does and the reporting of media on sports.
Oh, cool. First up. I often tell people that it's been amazing for me to spend the last 6 years transitioning into a broadcast career and thinking about, I'm coached for 35 years and all the competitive aspects of it. And then for the last 6 years, to every Friday, sitting in the building of your, at one time, competitors, imagine whatever business you're in, sitting in the boardroom or sitting with the CEO of your competitor, and to every Friday for 6 seasons, sit and visit with the players, the coaches, the general managers, to be able to actually watch their practices and to see what goes on. I dare say people always say, are you interested in going back into coaching? And my pat line is, they're looking for young and cheap, and I'm neither. So no. But if I were to, I promise you I would be a better coach for having gone through those experiences, visiting with the coaches and players in that regard, watching how they operate, and then doing the game. So much broader view of the game. When you're coaching and you're playing, regardless of what your perspective, you've got blinders on about you, your team, your perspective. What are you doing to survive? Kind of take those blinders off and see the league in a whole different way has been rewarding, and I've learned a lot.
Yeah, Adonal, I'd be interested in how the media has changed as far as interviewing athletes, because it's a lot different from what we heard on the earlier with Bobby Riggs and Max Baer. But when you think about how the media comes to you, the questions that they ask, do you just kind of shake your head after you've answered it?
Well, I think that part of the challenge today is that because of the role of social media that has in our game, is that people have much more intimate knowledge of a player in ways that they normally wouldn't have in the past. And that could be both a curse and it could be a blessing, depends on how you use social media. But I think that part of the challenge is that there is no sacred space. It used to be that you can bring your game to the floor, but now your game, we had a situation where a player went out the night before, and it was in social media that morning, so he has to deal with that question whether or not he has a good game or a bad game. The fact that he went out becomes more of an issue than the way that he plays. So I think that the challenge is that there's so much more media now, and the way that people ask questions is that they ask them knowing so much more about you than trying to find out what you know.
How did you counsel your players, Brian, about dealing with the media?
It's been an interesting transformation just in the time that I've been out. I left coaching in 2007. And this was just on the cusp of when texting and tweeting and all that began. And it was interesting because I was a part of it when we transformed. Before, you needed the media because that's how you got your message out. As Kevin Byrne, the Vice President of Communication for the Ravens, always used to remind me, you got to keep in mind, they help us sell stuff. That's what when I started out in this league, I was an assistant director of public relations for Bill Walsh, and my job was to advance games. This is an antiquated idea now, but when we would go on the road, I would go out leaving on Tuesday and spend the week going by the news, the written media, the newspapers, doing radio gigs, television, hand out the clips, do interviews to basically promote interest in the game all week long, and then also kind of took care of hotel arrangements, kind of a one-stop shopping. Well, now they don't advance games anymore because it's all on the internet. All that information is out there. So you've gone from where you kind of catered to the media because they delivered your message to now teams of, well, we can control our own message. We have our own radio. We have our own TV. We really don't need you anymore to get our message out. To where now they've lost control because the players do it themselves and bypass the organization altogether. And you're exactly right. One of the toughest things clubs face today is because you always want to manage the message to a degree. But now it was one thing to isolate it and regulate it as it went through the media as best you could. But now you've got to regulate your players as well. And as we've seen, that doesn't go real well.
Adonal, how credible do you think the media is today, given the questions that they ask, the way stories will go without having somebody verify the story and everything? How do athletes feel about the media when they see them coming toward them to interview them?
Well, I think that there's definitely a sense of anger and being more guarded because I think that dirt sells. I mean, it always has, and it always will. But I think that, I think that kind of a sacred space, I think most athletes would agree that that has been violated. I mean, now you can have stuff tweeted out of the locker room. I mean, there is really no sacred space anymore. And I think what it has kind of diluted the game a little bit, because we spend more time focusing on the ancillary stuff rather than how great the athlete is on the floor. And understanding that we all have, fallacies and we all have issues in our daily lives. And the question is, anyone under a mirror or a microscope that long is going to crack at some point. And I think that the question becomes now for organization is that when the crack happens, how that player is going to be rebuilt, because it's all but inevitable that it's going to happen.
Yeah, I want to get both of you a perspective on this, because when the story came down after the San Francisco 49ers game against Seattle and Richard Sherman said what he said on the sideline, I went right after the media. I mean, I'm one of those that's not afraid to call something bad even in my own profession. And I thought it was unfair for a kid that had just made an incredible play, knowing his background. He's a Stanford kid. He came out of Compton, California. He was, I think, either number 1 or number 2 in his high school class. And to catch him in that circumstance, in that environment, and Brian, you know how emotional these games are. But I'd like to get your perspective on how that was handled, what he said, and put it into a perspective that only people in sports that have had to deal with it would understand.
I think it was a fascinating study in where we are today. First off, as you said, it's hard for people to appreciate the emotional. I want to meet the guy that came up with the idea that 10 minutes after a loss, I got to stand up in front of the amassed media and talk. Just give me 10 minutes with that guy, because it was. I always joked after my Super Bowl win, again, the 3 hour, one of the most emotional 3 hours in your life, and the party that ensues, and you're up all night, and in the infinite wisdom of the NFL, they decide that the winning coach should have a news conference in front of 2,000 of the national media at 7 a.m. the next morning. That's not going to go well, let me tell you. But I thought the Richard Sherman example was a fascinating case study. And here, in the old day, for a player to have done and said the knucklehead things that Richard Sherman did, and to be able to control it going forward, that could have spun out of control. And he would have had no mechanism, because the media would have dealt with it strictly as they chose to deal with it, good or bad, and it may have been irreparable for him to be able to come back. But because of the social media, because he and the club could take a more active stance in that, and I watched Richard Sherman all that week afterwards, and then during this week of the Super Bowl in New York, craft his message, be able to get his message out, even if the media, for whatever reason, did not want to go there. He could control it himself, and he's a smart enough man, and I think he kind of reclaimed his stature a little bit by able to walk it back in a way that might not have translated through the media had he had to rely on that conduit. So you're exactly right, Donald. The biggest challenge today for these young players is trying to get these young players to understand this can be an asset, but it can be a liability. You have lost control of it, but they're their own culprits in that regard. It's them doing it to themselves. That idea of pause before you send, just educating to them, yes, this can be an asset as you look to try to brand yourself going forward, but you have to understand the liability of it as well.
So one of the, I remember my last year in Orlando, I love Stan Van Gundy, and we were having a difficult game. It was a nationally televised game, and the NBA decided that they wanted to move the cameras and the microphone into the locker room. And immediately before the game, we start making bets about how quickly this is going to last and how much data they're going to be able to get. And it all depends on how we're going to be doing at the halftime. Well, as the game kind of progressed, it was obvious that we were losing, and Stan Van Gundy does not like to lose. And we started making bets. Well, he got into the locker room, and the first thing that went, he rips the mic out and they throw it into the roof. I mean, I think that you're asking a player to emotionally engage in one of the most physical games, NFL, basketball. We're playing games where your body is on the line. Mentally, you've been driven to the limit. at 6'8", 6'9", I don't think I played anybody that was shorter. I was the shortest player in the NBA at my position. Everybody else was 7 feet or bigger. So I'm working really, really hard every day. So the thought that I could, control these things that quickly and switch from, playing one of the most aggressive games to like now dealing with the media, much as doing it at halftime, which is one of the most craziest thing I could imagine, which is this halftime interaction right after a game, is that you need to give player times to emotionally de-stress. And we forget that these games are very difficult. So I think for me, it's like when I watch what happened, I was shocked that this doesn't happen more often. Because players are being asked to do so much and then being asked to put on 2 different caps and get ready to face the media in something that is emotional and very extreme emotionally.
One more question before we open it up here. And Brian, talk to me a little bit about your pregame speech and your halftime speech to your teams, because I don't know whether they do any good at all. I mean, what does a coach say if they're up 30-0 or down 30-0?
Yeah, I know what they say when you're down 30. It can't be rebroadcast. So I do a lot of corporate speaking now, and I recoil a little bit when I'm introduced as a motivational speaker. Anytime you're a coach, okay, you're supposed to be a motivational. Because as Donald knows, that motivational stuff, the coach, for me, the first time they run down on a kickoff, get knocked on their backside and come up looking through that ear hole, all that motivational stuff goes right out the window. It's not going to last very long. So really, it's a matter of the message you're trying to communicate to your team. And again, via the media, you set a tone. A little different than in basketball, because that's the tough thing in football is you lose or whatever happens on Sunday, you have an entire week now that has to be mulled over, good or bad. In baseball, you can get in a batting slump, but the next night maybe you can get out of it. And you may be in a shooting slump, but the next night you can get out of it. Well, in football, you've got to deal with it that entire week. And so in dealing with that with the players, usually when Wednesdays I'd step in front of my 53 quasi-millionaires, you try to set a tone for what needs to happen for us to win this game. And I knew my message had gotten through when I could either hear on the radio or pick up the paper. And come Thursday or Friday, I'd start to see that kind of regurgitated back out through the media to say, okay, they're kind of getting the message. And then Saturday night and even on the pregame on Sunday, you try to bring it back to that seminal point, because it is all out there. The players, and usually in a real critical situation, I had the best asset of when I knew I really needed to deliver and that this had to hit a home run. I'd stand up in front of my team and say, Ray Lewis, come up here and talk to the team. Ray would take it off and we'd go out and beat somebody.
The one thing, Bubba Parrish used to play for the San Francisco 49ers, and he was a Christian athlete. And he was always preaching, even when he was in the game. I mean, he'd talk over to the guy on the defensive line, and he'd be preaching to him and everything else. So a friend of mine played against him. He says, the problem with Bubba? He said, I'd line up across from him, and he'd be preaching to me. The ball would get snapped, and he'd slap me upside the head. He said, knock me into next week. I know in the NBA, as a final question, there is a lot of trash talking that goes on. Mm-hmm. And, you're a Colgate guy. You're an articulate guy. It's not part of your makeup to a great degree, I say. But who were the great trash talkers? I assume Barkley was one.
Oh, absolutely. I think Gary Payton probably was the best one, because he would be dribbling, and he's a guard, and he would be talking, dribbling, running up the floor, talking to the fans, talking to the bench. And I'm running out of breath, and I can hardly breathe, and I'm like, how does he have that much energy to talk to everybody in this arena? And I'm dying over here, it's like, you can't guard me, and I'm running up the floor trying to get back in defense. And, it was shocking. Michael was also one of them as well, and I think the great thing about Michael is that if you look at Michael Jordan and you say, man, that's a nice shirt. What? you have something to say about my shirt? I'm going to kill you. You know, so I'm like, I like your shoes. You know, there was nothing you could say to him that he didn't take as motivation. So I do not understand to this day how they can do it. I've never been able to do it. I always felt I was dying out there half the time, and was just trying to make it through the games.
I will just leave you with this one note. In Oakland, there are two African-American gentlemen that are successful businessmen who have floor seats down in the corner. And it's known as Amen Corner. And they are the great hecklers. I mean, they do it cleanly. They do it nicely. I had them on the show one night because they are so creative. And maybe you were on the team when one of the guys left college early or came right out of high school when you could do that. And so anyway, he goes to the free throw line, and it's a quiet pause of a moment, and these two guys say, "Spell cat for me, and I'll give you the C and the T." So even the fans can get into it.
Yeah.
Should we open it up?
Yeah, let's open it up for questions.
Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Here we have a microphone.
We'll bring you the mic.
In the last few years in college and NFL games, we've been seeing at halftime, and Donald referred to media coverage at halftime, the coaches being interviewed as they're coming off the field. I can't imagine that they enjoy this and are probably being told that they need to do it. So little is useful in what they have to say because they're running off the field to address their team, or when they're coming back out, they're focused on the second half. Has there been any kind of a effort among coaches to put an end to this practice?
You want to put it to a vote for the coaches? It's kind of like the post-game news conference. We weren't consulted about that. I mean, but it is, yeah, it gives, and having been on the broadcast side now, you get a sense, and the young sideline reporters, usually a female, which is not a bad strategic move to, good-looking blonde to say, "Hey, gee, would you talk to me?" compared to someone that looks like me. I remember, and again, you're right, the information is kind of innocuous. It's like, what do you want from me? I remember we played Tennessee one time, and a big rivalry at the time, and going to the playoffs. And it was one of those games we happened to be dominating. And Armin Kantaya was the sideline reporter. Now does more on the street side for CBS and 60 Minutes, does a great job. And he's just trying to do his job. And we had just totally dominated the game. But the very last series was like 21-0 at half. But the last series, Steve McNair and the Titans had gotten a little bit of a roll and got down across the 50 for the first time in the game, and then the half ended. So I'm running off, and they had prearranged. I knew Armin's going to come up, and he goes, "Well," and I don't know why it hit me wrong. And Armin's a good friend. He went to San Diego State, and I've coached there. And he said, "Well, are you a little concerned about their last drive?" And I looked at him, and I go, "Armin, they haven't scored." He says, "Yeah, but they moved the ball really well that last drive." "Armin, it's 21-0. And they're still not going to score. What do you want, man?" And people thought, "Oh, boy, you really shot him down." And he was fine with it, but you're right. Sometimes you get those questions like, "Did you just see the game that I saw?" So you're right. Believe me, if we're up to the coaches, they would do away with that.
Ron, tell us about the time you were standing in front of Candlestick Park when the earthquake hit.
Yeah. 1989, you always remember where you were at some particular point. It had been a very hot day in San Francisco. The Giants and the A's were playing in game number 4 of the World Series. And I was doing, also, before my show started at 7 o'clock, I was doing something for a local radio station. And all of a sudden, the antennas on all the news vans started going like this. And I said, "Oh, gee, the wind picked up at Candlestick," which was something new. Well, it wasn't the wind, let me tell you something. It was the earthquake. And certainly Al Michaels did a wonderful job, but Al had been in San Francisco, so he knew immediately what it was. I went back, and our building was damaged to some degree, so we weren't on the air with the network, but I was helping the local station to some degree. But the one thing that is such a vivid memory in my mind is at 2 o'clock in the morning when I finally was able to get out of town, driving across the Golden Gate Bridge. It was still very, very warm, and I looked over my shoulder, and I saw the smoke rising out of the neighborhoods where the fires had been. But the other thing, too, is that because they had lost water pressure down in the neighborhood right on the bay, they had to bring fire boats in, and they had to haul the the hoses from the fireboats up to where they needed to use them. And I'll never forget seeing men in three-piece suits and women in high heels helping to haul those hoses. We never had any damage done. People didn't take advantage of it. And that is probably about humanity one of the things I'll always remember. There you go.
Back?
This may sound a little bit irrelevant to the discussion, but being a Washington resident, I thought I would ask you all. In the world of football or sports world in general, what's the feeling about the name of the Washington football team?
Great question.
Do you all think it's going to change just in the football world? What do you think?
You know, I heard Commissioner Goodell speak on this at the Super Bowl, and certainly, more so than ever, we have to be very conscious of the perspective of those involved and how they may view certainly the Native Americans with regards to that. And I have no reason to question it, but Commissioner Goodell was very eloquent about the fact that the overwhelming communication they get from Native Americans across the board is very positive about what the Redskin name means, because it is a name, it isn't meant to be derogatory. It is this, we want to name our teams this, we want to hail this, we want this to be at the forefront of our championships. And even though certainly you have to be responsive to those that would take offense to it possibly for whatever reason, according to Commissioner Goodell, he says, until I can see where the mainstream Native Americans, in the majority of it, want to see that, this is something that they're very supportive of it maintaining the name, because the majority seem to be in favor and do not find it offensive.
I might just add that this is something I've talked a lot about on the program and tried to get the feel of remember, I've got not only a national audience, but a worldwide audience and many, many millions. And I remember the discussion we had on this one night. This was 4 or 5 years ago, because it's come up a number of times. And a woman called me and she said, I'm Native American. And she said, I'd like the people to understand one thing. I have to explain to my daughter that we don't look like the Cleveland Indians logo. And so there are sensitivities there. And Adonal, I'd be interested, as an African-American, your perspective on this. Because, I mean, I don't think they would allow a team to be called, the Whiteys or the Blackies or any of those things. What is the difference, and how do you view it as an African-American?
Well, I think one of the challenges is that you have to look at through the lens of history. And I think sometimes is that what might be okay 30 years ago, I think that our generation certainly have a much different perspective. And I think that you can't just look at it through and say, well, some people don't think it's bad. You have to look at it and say, when you look at a pluralistic society, is this hurts more than it helps? And it can't be any idea of monetary gain from it. So I think that part of what people feel that is part of the problem here is that there is so much money attached to this name that it's not being given a fair conversation because of the monetary implication behind it and what it means. So I think for me it'd be a lot better to have this conversation devoid of the question of the financial legacy that is attached to this name. And I think that people see that as saying, well, we're not giving it really a good go of conversation, because we're more worried about the implication of what it means if we get rid of that name and the amount of things that is attached to that. So I think that will be the way that I look at it. How could we have this outside of a vacuum, outside of the confines of money, outside of that, and really see just to where we are right now, 30 years later? Is through our kids' eyes, how would they see that? Would they see it as negative? Or because where it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it may not have been, but I think now is that we see those things a lot differently.
Yeah, just a quick comment, because it's in the news an awful lot. I'd like to get Brian and yours as well. Jason Collins with the Nets, I'm hopeful, another Stanford kid. We've moved beyond labeling, and you as a coach, we got a kid that wants to be in the NFL. Brian, quick response on that?
From Missouri.
Yeah.
Michael Sams. Yeah, it's interesting, particularly at the Combine. I do the Combine broadcast for the NFL Network, and this was the first time certainly Michael Sam's declaring his sexuality. Prior to that, this was the first time in mass that he was going to stand in front of the media. And he did a fabulous job. He really did. And I think it moved us forward in terms of how this is going to be dealt with. The unfortunate side, and I think with Collins as well, the real test is when a top-line mainstream player chooses to make that declaration. Michael Sam's, frankly, is a mid-round, which means he could be a late draft choice or not at all. He's a good football player, and I'm talking strictly from a football analysis standpoint, a little one-dimensional, needs to be a good special teamer. I can see him making an NFL roster, but strictly from an athletic football standpoint, it's going to be a hit-or-miss proposition. And unfortunately, there will be those that make the assertion that, well, if he doesn't make it, it was because he came out the way that he did. And I will tell you this, the NFL, if you not alluded to it, it's all about the money. I don't care what and who you are. If you can help me win and help me make the money that I'm going to make by winning, then I don't care what your background is. You know, an NFL, as is a NBA locker room, but an NFL locker room, 53 players, 7 practice squad, is one of the most diverse populations you've ever seen. Religiously, politically, racially, geographically. And so it really is an amalgam. And I have no question that he'll be absorbed into the NFL should he make it very readily. And they'll very much, you know, take him as one of our own, and this is our guy type of deal. So it's great that the dialogue has been pressed that way. But it will be interesting, you know, Mr. Collins, he's kind of on the back end of his career. Right. And so if he doesn't make it, there'll be those that say, well, it's because of what he declared. Could be just he's reached that point in his career, he can't play anymore. But when that frontline player comes out, then that will be the real test of it.
I agree. I mean, I think that what I'm used to is that the guy on my right and the guy on the left, I mean, we don't really know what most of them do when they left the gym anyway. Well, we probably can guess. But I think that the idea that, you know, you have to worry about, you know, the person next, I think that is greatly overblown. I mean, I think players are so much more sophisticated in terms of how they see people. Would you have some guys that have an issue about it? Yeah, but the first time you go on the basketball court and you absolutely nail the other guy, it's all over. It becomes war. So, you know, you'd be like, oh, yeah, you know, I think he's this. And then he goes up for a rebound and he hits the other guy. It's war. I mean, the game is on. You know, the same thing I think with football. The moment you go out there and you drill somebody else, you know, it's like, all right, we have a game. You know, I think you're right in terms of, you know, we have this issue. We have to allow the space for these guys to fail. And my worry is that we wouldn't allow them to fail and we wouldn't allow them to be successful. So we have to, the success, I know we want it, but we have to allow them room to fail. And that means that you have to be able to not make the team and be, not because you're gay, but because you're maybe not to the level of another guy that is competing for your position. There is 11 spots in the NBA, and you know, there's 450 basketball players globally, and people fighting for those 450 spots. So you have to, as much as you give them the opportunity to be successful, I'm worried that they're not going to give them the opportunity to fail gracefully. And that to me is my worry.
I just want to again thank Matt and Gene both for their help and
question.
Oh, my own producer.
Oh, yeah. Man, you're going to be in trouble.
Now, I just wanted to ask you guys about how you think sports can bridge a gap between countries and nations, with Rodman going over to North Korea and all that. And, of course, us going to Iraq and Afghanistan and all that, talking to soldiers. What do you see, I mean, talking to the local people that in Afghanistan and Iraq about sports and recognizing Brian when he walks into the DFAC or whatever. How do you feel about, you know, the relations with, you know, when there's problems in the world and sports bridging that gap between that?
Well, just the asset that it can be, because it can immediately, whatever those geopolitical, economic tensions might be, sports breaks it down to the human level, which is the great thing. It immediately puts it as it's you versus I. We're going to get that ball, and we're going to do whatever it is to compete with it, and whatever our differences or whatever separates us, we can find, like a common language, even if we don't speak the same language, we'll find a commonality there that gives us the opportunity to go, oh, okay, yeah, all right, you are like me, because we do have that similar motivation, and maybe it can be the catalyst for that. And I think the ping pong diplomacy, back in the day, is very, very real in terms of the ability, whether it's the arts, whether it's athletics, that combine us that way. And it's been, again, eye-opening for me and some of the travels that we've had to be able to, for people to recognize they may know nothing about football and have no clue who I was. But the fact that they become aware in another country that I was a sports figure, they immediately would reach out and try to find some connection because they can relate to that.
Yeah, I will say that, for me, I just got back from Morocco with Ruth Wiley. She's a WNBA player. And we did not speak the language. And, so we were being very demonstrative and stuff like that. But, one of the greatest moments is that she, the ladies are supposed to be very demure and stuff like that. So I allow her to box me out. And she probably boxed me out into the next county. She hit me so hard. And you can see the girls are trying to figure out, what's that boundary. And she was like, hit him. And one of the girls, line up and just drill this guy. And this guy had this look of like, this is not supposed to happen. It was like shock. And she was over there celebrating. So, sports has the ability to do amazing things. But I think, on the other hand, when you look at the case of Dennis Rodman and the North Korea trip, you have to see that we're not political figures. And we have to be very conscious of what we support. And I think for me, what was very heartbreaking about that trip is that there are people over there that are being really, really abused. And you, as an athlete, have to understand when you lend your name to a cause, you have to be aware of what is being used and how it's being used. And I think that what is most disappointing about the Dennis Rodman trip is that I don't think he understood that him being there is giving voice, not to the people. He didn't go and walk with the people in the street. He went to give a birthday party to a dictator. And I think that's the line. If you're going in and you're shaking things up by challenging the local organic population, I think most people will say, okay, you're trying to do something that helps. You're trying to bridge a gap. But when you go and give a celebration to a dictator that is imprisoning his people and murdering them, I think it's a little different.
Somebody else back there?
I would also add one thing, that there's a role for the Library of Congress to archive these recordings and make sure that they aren't misinterpreted in the future or reinvented for what they weren't, and words put in their mouths. The athletes will be able to speak for themselves in perpetuity. And given the amazing technology that we have to distribute things digitally, it's a worldwide distribution of that. And that's a really important aspect that when we take a collection like this, we see the global implications of it as well.
And Gene, you bring up another good point, because this is not sound bites. These are long interviews, so you can hear the person, like we are doing here today, explain what they're talking about.
Right.
I think there's a police officer in the back that had a question.
Good question for you guys on the panel is, big topic that they're talking about now is Division I, especially college players. Should they get paid, or should they get paid or not get paid? I believe a stipend's entitled, because they are making these universities a ton of money. Coming from a student athlete myself, a stipend for me just to go get a pizza with my friends or the teammates is just fine enough. I'm not saying I need $1 million, but the thing is, I think these student athletes are making these universities a ton of money, and I do believe that they should get a stipend, and all these NCAA regulations that they put on there for suspending players because they took a $20 or from a boosters is kind of ridiculous to me. But I'd like to hear what you guys think.
I think, do they deserve to be paid? No question. But my concern, the law of unintended consequences. If we do get to that point, then my fear is the amount of monies that are generated outside of the bigger sports for scholarships for the minor sports. And I don't have that figure on me, but it's staggering in terms of the opportunities that the universities can provide by way of scholarships to a number of athletes, particularly in the minor sports that are not income-generating sports, that if those monies now have to go towards the football and the basketball players, which they likely deserve, I'm afraid that the law of unintended consequences means that there's going to be a whole bunch of volleyball scholarships, lacrosse scholarships, that you're going to have a lot of young people that have an opportunity to go to college via these scholarships that are not, and it would be a regrettable consequence. That's a lot to put on the backs of the star athletes in the revenue-generating sports, but I think there is value in terms of the college education, that experience. It's a fine line to walk, but I would be concerned if it actually happened.
I would say that, my concern would be that of gender equity. We, Title IX, I think, create the opportunity for an even playing field across campus. And a university have limited resource. And I mean, the question becomes, when you take the top 10 university out of the picture, then you worry about the next 50. And they're not making as much money. At the same time, I remember having one pair of shoes and having to go everywhere with a one pair of shoes, and I didn't have money to get a snack, to get an extra meal, or especially when the university was closed during Christmas break, and having to figure out a way to eat in campus and stuff like that. So I think that I always say that I remember I left the Colgate a year early to go pro. And so I was on a scholarship, and when I went back to get my degree, they charged me almost $15,000, $20,000 to finish up my degree. And I'm like, couldn't we at least, agree that we had a 4-year education here, that was part of the process? I think that there is room within the way we do stuff. Like for me, one of the things that we should guarantee is that any kid that go to university and spend a year or more, that they should be able to go back to that university anytime in the career and finish up. And if they don't want it, they should be able to pass it to the kids. Because I think that education is going to be that thing that is going to set those players and give them an opportunity to find opportunity elsewhere. So I think, guaranteeing a 4-year education, guaranteeing some kind of stipend, guaranteeing basic insurance. I mean, you have players today that could make $20, $30, $40 million by going pro. If they stay, they have to find money to pay for that insurance that will protect them. I mean, there's some basic stuff we can do, but we have to have a conversation about it in a way that it's not about that they're not entitled to it. I think we all could agree that something needs to change at that level. The question is, how do you what exactly do you do and make sure that it's equal and make sure that it could apply across universities? Because we do have over 300 plus Division I universities in the country. So.
Last question.
I have noticed a disturbing, to me, trend of broadcasters, mostly on TV because I'm not to the radio, sorry Ron, as much as I am seeing sports on television, that broadcasters are becoming the show as opposed to the athletes being the show. I'm going, when did they become more important than the athletes they're interviewing?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a good comment. And Brian, I want you to address this because you've had to deal with it, and I did at the network. But what has changed is the focus on entertainment over sports competition. And it's just the fact that we have the USA Today, which is not in-depth. It's, it's what have you done for me lately? It's 15 minutes. I mean, that's where we are. That's the mentality that we have today.
Yeah, I work with Deion Sanders. So, in fact, I did a thing with Deion the other day, and I had said something that Deion liked, and he says, Coach, I like that. He says, I'm going to use that. I'll give you credit the first time. After that, it's mine. You're right. And one of the things that I had to learn in transitioning into doing games, and I had some great mentors, which were Tom Brenneman, who Ron knows, and Bob Stenner was my producer, was one of the legendary producers, long time in the league, started with Summerall and Madden, and learned that really the obligation, I think the best broadcaster is the one that get out of the way of a good game. There's times when, you know what, yeah, maybe you need to fill here because this is really a stinker of a game and your audience is about ready to leave you. But for the most part, if you can stay out of the way of the game and let it be about the game, let it be about the players. But you're exactly right. Unfortunately, the more of we get of the others and the audiences respond to it by way of the clicks or the going to the to those particular best damn sports show type of mentality, the shout show type guys, yeah, they wear me out as well. But and the market will bear that out when the market finds no, we don't want those guys. CNN is finding that out right now. When you look at the on a national level, when you see the huge hit that CNN has taken because they were starting to take that turn. I don't mean to be too big on this, but the Pierce Morgan style of, whoa, no, we'd really rather hear from the people you're interviewing and not you. That will turn it back the other way because the mass market can dictate this is what we want to hear. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. I've always said that good ball games get good broadcasts, but the tough ones get better broadcasts because that's when you really have to do. I'll just leave you with one story, and that is the fact that I was doing the Seattle Supersonics when Bill Russell was the coach of that team, and he always loved beating the Celtics in Boston. And this was the last broadcast I did for Cairo Television in Seattle. Anyway, I was supposed to have JoJo White, but because the Sonics beat Boston, he stood me up for the postgame show. We had 35 minutes to fill to the top of the hour for the newscast, and so I had to fill. Well, I had gone through stats, gone through the highlights, the label on my jacket. I had gone through everything, and we still have 10 minutes to fill when we go into the last commercial break. And I am hot because I had been at CBS where we had production meetings for, well, if this happens, that we'll do this, if that happens. And on a local station, they don't necessarily do that, now, especially in a provincial area like Seattle was back there in the 70s when I was doing it. So I'm thinking, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do for 10 minutes. We're in the Boston Garden, and before they come out and come back to me, I see a little old man pushing a broom and cleaning up. So I grabbed him. He had been the janitor at the Boston Garden for 40 years and had seen every great moment in Boston Garden history, and I interviewed him for the last 10 minutes. I want to thank you all for coming. This means a great deal for me and to my partners and also my friends here, and to Matt and Jean. Thank you very much for having us, and we'll come back anytime you want us. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.